That video gets me every time. I can't watch it and not get touched. I want to talk about it in a moment. But first, let's review where we are now in this book study, in this study of compassion. Let's review. We are in the fourth step of 12 of Karen Armstrong's compassionate work, her charter for compassion, her international effort to ask us to find compassion in our lives. First, she urged us to learn about compassion, just to survey it, to understand it from the many religious perspectives that there are. And then she asked us to see it in our world, to survey our worlds, to see where it was and wasn't, where it is and isn't in our lives. Third, she asked us to have compassion for ourselves. This was last week in worship. To do that difficult work of appreciating ourselves for who we are. And today she asks us to know empathy, to explore and understand empathy. The question today is whether we can cultivate empathy or tap a natural empathy within us. The world's religious traditions say there is a natural movement of empathy from self to other. So finally, in our exploration, we start to arrive at something that we begin to understand when we think of compassion. Armstrong says she got a glimpse of how religion has tried to teach empathy from her own Catholic tradition when she was translating the philosopher from the 11th century, Peter Abelard's view of Christianity and his image of the cross, that I think in some ways she indicates has been interpreted poorly. She writes, "When our hearts break in sympathy, it is this interior movement of compassion and instinctive empathy that saves us," speaking of the Christ on the cross. It is the movement of our compassion that saves us. Rebecca Parker this week at General Assembly said almost the same thing. She said that to interpret the violence of the cross in Christianity as a way to joy is a profound theological error, because it should lead us to grief and thus to empathy. Most religions, Christianity among others, have taught that empathy is natural. It is something we feel when we understand the suffering of another. It is something we feel when we understand the struggles of another. And history has shown that, I believe, there is an instinctive response that comes with empathy, but it needs two things. It needs first our ability to attend to the empathy that is within us, our ability to see it, to notice it, and it also, secondly, needs some training, a way forward to understand how empathy works. Armstrong talks about how reason is the door to empathy, that we are in ways taught to stand back from a me-first mentality and appreciate the plight of others. In a sense, we learn this response to care for others. We learn it as an exercise. Now, when I say exercise, I mean exercise. How many of you have been to the gym this week? Or done a yoga class or took a run? Like, you didn't just do that. You had to learn how to do that, right? You didn't just walk outside and start doing yoga on your first front lawn without ever being taught, right? You had to learn and you had to make a pattern of it. And the same is true for empathy. Empathy is a muscle that we are taught to use, one that we have to teach our children. And we have to learn and continually relearn ways to appreciate the struggles of others. Not intellectually, but emotionally. And it's difficult to learn this in this day and age. I think we as a people are becoming callous to empathy for others. We are losing sight of what our universalist ancestors taught us or planted in our tradition, that we are good, that we are enough, and that what happens to one happens to all. It is easy to get callous to having empathy for others because we are bombarded in ways like no generation ever has been, with images of stories and struggle, which can, over time, make us dull to the response. We are also being given constantly images that are more damaging, lessons that are more damaging than even just the overexposure to suffering. And that is that we are told and taught that we are more important than those who find misfortune in the world, that we should protect ourselves with a fierce and dangerous vehemence. We are bombarded with images of criminals. We are told to fear people coming over borders, told that the building of fences and the militarizing of borders will protect us from our fear. And we are hunted by marketing ads that sell us things like the iPad. We are in danger not only closing our capacity to flex our empathy muscle, but we are in danger of losing our way to the empathy gym. We are in danger of buying into the idea that we live in I communities and go to I churches and must save ourselves, and to hell with the rest of them. Of course, there are ways back to understanding where we can flex the empathy muscle. And one way has always been through art, as Armstrong says. When she talks about the Greeks going to theater almost to study and be taught empathy, I think yes, but they didn't have Fox News and Google. They went to the theater, their experience unsullied by 1,000 bits of information. They saw the horrors of cruelty in those plays, the challenges of those lost on journeys trying to get home, the tragic accidents and misunderstandings which led characters to do unspeakable things. Think about Oedipus, not as an evil character, but one who requires our empathy. Different than their Roman neighbors, who are my ancestors, I am sad to say, who relished in beheadings and grotesque failures of characters and paraded their defeated enemies to their executions in events they called triumphs. The Greek plays taught people what empathy looked like, and they learned to feel deeply what was happening in those morality plays. And these are the roots of our art, thankfully. This empathy is the kind we probably felt when we were watching that 4-minute video. I hope you felt that video. What is it that breaks our hearts in that video? I think it reminds us that the care of elders is often done with impatience. That the tenderness and patience of a father is how we all wish to be, not only with our children, but with each other. That the reconciliation we can have between human beings can be swift and tangible. That when we break through the walls that separate or annoy us about each other, we can find empathy. That empathy that we feel, though easier when we are distant from it, is harder when we are sitting on that bench. How would we feel if we were one or other of those characters? Now, empathy is easy to talk about. But the title of my sermon is Caring for Scoundrels. And I think this is the ultimate test of whether empathy is real. We can all define the scoundrels in our lives. I know you have one or two that you have known. Maybe they even lived in your own home. To care for them is perhaps the ultimate test of whether any of this is true. Now, I have had on occasion an experience of caring for a scoundrel or two, not in this church, I guarantee you. What I mean is that I've been in the presence of a person or two who cultivated hate in their lives, who was so self-oriented that no one else had meaning in their eyes or value. It is this type of person that pushes our hope for empathy to the brink. When I was a chaplain at San Francisco General Hospital, I had this experience poignantly. Every day that I worked as a chaplain in the AIDS ward was a new adventure. I would take on a patient and visit them once or more a week. And most patients were dear and grateful for those visits, except one. He was sour. He didn't care a lick for anyone in his life. He treated the family who came to visit with disdain and his friends who came to bring him things with a stiff arm. He said nasty things to them, and eventually they stopped coming. But it was my job to visit him, and he was dying. I visited him once or twice a week, like visiting a caged lion. I braced at the door for his charges and attacks, but it was my job. And even when I wished that he would die faster, a thought chaplains should not have, my supervisors encouraged me to stick with it and keep showing up. I had no expectations that he would change, no great hopes for him, having lost my hope for him. But I kept going. And I watched as he got lonelier and lonelier and quieter, and the more I visited him, the more he turned his back on me, literally. Some days we would sit together for an hour or so, his back turned. And then one day, in one of those silent visits, he sobbed, still his back turned to me. And in sort of a confession, he apologized for a life of being a scoundrel. The list was long that I had to receive. What did I know? I was just a seminary student, but I hung in there in silence. He never looked at me again. He died soon after without another word of apology. And when his friends came to collect his things, they spat a kind of solemn but loyal pain about him. They described a person abandoned by his family, a kind of self-deportation, a life of abuse and self-abuse, the kind of life no one of us would wish for ourselves or for anyone else. In the end, they described the making of a scoundrel, a man who had friends and broken relationships. Like a Greek play, this man lived in solitude until he died. The man lived without compassion given or received, but a person with dignity all the same. What that experience taught me was that even scoundrels have a past and families and friends and the need of compassion and empathy, however difficult it might be to be in their presence. When I asked my doctor and nurse friends how you care for such people, they consistently said, you create good boundaries around them. You state what you are willing to do for them and what you are not willing to do. You state what you can and cannot do. I think the same is true for any of us, a good response. For those people that even border on being scoundrels in our lives is to draw those boundaries. And beyond that, I think we must ask ourselves, what about our scoundrel breaks our heart? Or in what ways does that scoundrel's behavior mirror some of our own? You see, what I mean is that a wise person once said to me, Daniel, you will be most repelled by the people who resemble your own weaknesses and the things you do not accept about yourself. I think the lesson in this chapter is that to be empathic, we have to be willing to be unsettled. We have to be willing to go into the suffering of others so that we can receive the education we need, so that we can exercise the muscles of empathy. This is the key. To experience the suffering of others and to let it in, we must be willing to feel the pain and suffering of the world. Now that's not easy, and it's probably not that much fun. I met a colleague on the airplane to Phoenix this week who's on sabbatical, and he told me he was using his time to go to places like Worms in Germany, where Kristallnacht started, and to Dachau, and to the concentration camps of Poland, and to the memorial site of the potato famine the Irish call the Great Hunger. And I looked at my friend and said, "Are you having fun?" Respecting that he was deepening his empathy all the same. The work of empathy may not be fun, but I believe it is good for us and our communities and the world. What we need to do is to exercise those muscles that we have neglected, to get past all the things that make us callous to having empathy for those who struggle and suffer, and make our way to the gym of empathy. The poet Julie Kalinikos says, "Empathy is a cosmic panacea. Please do more than pray," she says. Love, caress, hope. I agree. So may it be. I hope to see you on Wednesday and or again next Sunday, and I wish you well with the exercise of your empathy, for it is crucial work for the good of our world. Amen and amen.